Star Trek: The Next Generation, Starfleet Academy, Crossfire, Chapter 7. Geordi felt a cool wind on his face. It would have been refreshing, except for the foul stench that came with it. The smell was a combination of burning debris, spilled fuel, sweat, and death. He stared through his visor to discover an amazing sight. Alophim was not an uninhabited planet as he had imagined. There were skyscrapers and modern buildings, only now they were empty, bombed-out ruins. Whole walls had tumbled down, and smoke curled from blackened windows. Scattered about were a few delicate spires, statues, and stained-glass windows, proving that Alophim must have been a beautiful place at one time. Now it was a wasteland of broken concrete, smashed glass, and green-skinned Orions. There had to be at least 100 Orion soldiers guarding the field where they had beamed down. It must look odd, thought Geordi. An army of grubby, battle-weary soldiers meeting a band of young people in sparkling dress uniforms. Getting curious, the soldiers edged closer, and the young cadets backed up. They gripped their musical instruments as if they might be stolen by this grungy crowd. The Orions returned the reaction and gripped their bazooka-like phaser rifles as if they were more important. Geordi saw both men and women among the green-skinned soldiers. With their sunken faces and blank eyes, they looked as burned out as the buildings. "Attention!" shouted a grizzled old Orion. The soldiers fell into a rough line and shouldered their weapons. "That's better," said the old Orion, who seemed to be a sergeant. "These people have come a long way to entertain you. They want to show you that you have not been forgotten." "That's not exactly true," thought Geordi. The cadets didn't want to be here either, but now was not the time to mention that. They were going to leave after the concert, but these young soldiers were going to stay behind. Many of them would probably die on this forgotten planet. "Escort them to the amphitheater," ordered the sergeant. One young soldier stepped up to Geordi. "This way, please." He walked off, and Geordi fell into step beside him. "Have you been here long?" asked Geordi. The Orion looked around nervously, as if it was forbidden to talk. No one seemed to be paying attention to them. 3 years, he said softly. "This must be an important planet for you to fight so hard," said Geordi. The Orion looked down. "We are mercenaries. We are fighting because it is our job." Geordi tried not to look shocked. They weren't even fighting for their home world. They were doing this horrible work for some third party. He reminded himself that the Orions had only recently given up slavery. Most of them were from a poor working class who were used to selling themselves to survive. They walked down a cluttered street and turned a corner. Geordi gasped. The amphitheater was nothing more than a huge crater with cement stubble for seats. In the center of the crater was a raised wooden stage, and it was surrounded by a sea of wary green faces. It was hard to tell if there were 10, 20, or 30,000 of them seated in the rubble, but there were a lot. A murmur surged from the crowd as if the entrance of the Starfleet Academy band was some sort of miracle. On the stage, Orions were setting up the band's music stands. Captain Webb, Commander Baxter, and Jock 2 were present, overseeing the preparations. Geordi noticed that his fellow roadies were not included in the group. He was the only non-musician who had beamed down. Captain Webb probably didn't want to endanger any more people than he had to. Plus, Geordi knew Jock 2, and he was getting the hang of the Cordan phase modulator. Will Riker stepped up behind him and gazed at the grim audience. "They look like the Walking Dead," he whispered. "This place is the pits. We shouldn't be playing here. We should be trying to end this stupid war." "We can't interfere," said Geordi, "because the Orions don't belong to the Federation. All we can do is make these people forget their troubles for an hour or so. Will headed up the stairs to the stage. I know all about the Prime Directive, but this is crazy. Who is their enemy, anyway? Geordi shook his head. Who knows? The Orions are only mercenaries fighting for money, and their enemy could be mercenaries too. Who knows what parties are behind this conflict? Maybe it's a good thing that we stumbled upon it so we can report it to Starfleet. If we live long enough, muttered Will. He and Geordi strode onto the wooden stage and stared across the vast ocean of soldiers. The Orion soldiers were eerily quiet. Let's just play this gig and head home, said Will with a shiver. Only it wasn't that simple. As the band began to play before the hushed throng, a strange thing happened. The audience began to weep. At first it was disturbing to hear thousands of battle-weary Orions sobbing at their lively music, but the band began to realize that this raw show of emotion was a compliment. That invisible thread between performers and audience is woven every performance, but that day it was especially strong. Every song they played connected hard with the weeping audience, especially the ragtime and blues numbers. When Geordi hit the train whistle on Take the A-Train, the phase modulator howled like a lonely coyote. The band could do no wrong. They played every song they knew, some they had only rehearsed, and the concert ran over 2 hours. When they finally ended with Stardust, the clarinet player, Duperrin, made his instrument wail. His lilting solo floated over the crowd, and a multitude of Orions wailed along with him. It sent chills all over Geordi's body, and his eyes welled with tears. After Stardust, they rose to take a bow, but there was no applause. Instead, the Orions jumped to their feet and roared at the top of their lungs. It was a ferocious shout, releasing all the pent-up rage at their terrible fate. The band members were grinning like fools, basking in the glory. As Jock 2 had said, they would never find an audience as grateful as this one. As the musicians bowed and waved, Geordi noticed something odd in the overcast sky. It was something a person without a visor might not see, because the massive vapor trails were behind thick clouds. Shuttlecraft were his first guess, but the trails were too small for shuttlecraft. They were more like one-man fighter aircraft, strafing machines. "Captain Webb!" shouted Geordi. He forced his way from the back of the stage, through the chairs and bandstands of the musicians. Stinson grabbed Geordi with a beefy arm as he rushed past. "Listen to that," said Stinson with a grin. "They love us." Geordi pointed into the sky. "Don't you see them?" Stinson peered into the gloomy clouds and shook his head. "See what?" "Geordi, you need to sit down and relax." With a swarm of deadly aircraft zooming down, Geordi had no choice but to ignore him. He waved like a madman and yelled, "Captain Webb! Captain Webb!" The captain turned around at the same moment that a shrieking alarm ripped the air. The sound was so painful that Geordi dropped to his knees and gripped his ears. He tried to concentrate on what was happening, but electromagnetic interference jolted his senses. Someone had turned on some very powerful jamming equipment, and it reduced Geordi to a blind man. The Coridan phase modulator fell out of his hands, and he dropped to his knees to retrieve it. After all he'd been through with that gizmo, he wasn't about to lose it. Geordi groped around on the stage until he found the oval-shaped device. Then he hugged it to his chest. Alarmed shouts brought his attention back to the battle, and he looked up to find his vision returning. The act of retrieving the phase modulator had helped clear his mind. Despite the sirens and jamming, Geordi found that he could control his visor if he concentrated. He gazed upward to see a formation of sleek fighters punch through the clouds and come swooping toward the stage. Atop the stage, he was directly in their line of fire. Geordi held his breath, expecting to die. Suddenly, the first wave of ships went into weird tailspins, shooting harmlessly out of the way. 2 of them crashed into each other, causing spectacular fireworks in the cloudy sky. Geordi gaped, and he wondered whether the electromagnetic interference was some sort of defensive weapon. A second wave of ships came zooming in, and they apparently made an adjustment. They never wavered as they zoomed in for the kill. Geordi looked over and saw many of his comrades from the band scurrying down the stairs. His momentary blindness had delayed him, but at least they were getting away. He turned back to the battle. To his horror, he found that he couldn't help watching. The aircraft swooped down, firing narrow beams in a strafing pattern. Bravely, the Orions leaped to their feet and returned fire with their bazooka-sized phasers. Several aircraft erupted in flames, and the ground shuddered where they hit. An explosion blasted out the right side of the stage, and Geordi was pitched off his feet. Clutching the phase modulator to his chest, he rolled off the slanted stage and fell into the dirt. Explosions erupted all around him, showering him with chunks of soil. When Geordi tried to stand up, a large body plummeted into him and knocked him flat on his back. It was Will Riker. Will immediately began crawling back toward the stage, which was already in flames. "Wait!" called Geordi. "We've got to beam up!" He banged the communicator badge on his chest, but nothing happened. "Go ahead," shouted Will. "You got my trombone working, and I'm not going to leave it behind. I'll be right back." Will hoisted himself back onto the creaking stage and crawled under the smoke and out of sight. Geordi slumped onto his back and watched the battle rage around them. He had seen space battles, but they were calm compared with a ground war. This was insanity. Bedlam. After a moment, he tried his comm badge again. There was no response. Whatever was jamming his visor was also jamming communications and the aircraft. With every passing second, more aircraft adjusted to the jamming. They broke through the clouds and swooped down on the stalwart Orion soldiers. Geordi glanced around, looking for his comrades from the band, but they had scattered in all directions. This was pure survival, every man for himself. With no weapons or communications, the only option was to run. But Geordi wasn't running. He was waiting for that stupid Riker to come back with his trombone. Suddenly, he heard a crunching sound, and the stage buckled further. He stared up to see a thin figure sailing through the air. Geordi barely managed to roll out of the way before Will fell on top of him. Will grinned and held up his trombone. "Got it!" The burning stage groaned loudly and tilted toward them. The cadet scurried out of the way as it collapsed with a whoosh, shooting a wall of sparks into the air. Geordi fell to the ground, coughing from the smoke and dust. He felt a strong hand grab the back of his neck and propel him forward. "Come on!" shouted Will. "No time to rest!" With the trombone in one hand and Geordi in the other, Will pounded up the hill. Geordi tripped and sprawled on top of something, and he opened his eyes to discover that it was a wounded Orion. When he looked closer, he gasped. It was Jock 2. His green forehead had a scarlet gash across it, and he looked more dead than alive. The former music judge opened his eyes and stared at Geordi. Then his bloody hand reached up and grabbed the cadet's dress uniform. The young cadet tried to pull away, but even dying, the Orion's grip was strong. "I told you it was important you come," he said hoarsely. "Thank you. I am sorry for this." "We've got to get you help," shouted Geordi. Again he hit his comm badge, and again nothing happened. The battle continued to rage all around, and nobody seemed to care that a man was dying. "Too late," rasped Jock 2. "But I die with your music in my heart. I couldn't ask for a finer memory." He closed his eyes, and his hand slid away from Geordi's soiled dress uniform. "Come on!" "Come on!" growled Will. "You can't help him now." Will dragged Geordi to his feet, and they crawled uphill together, trying to get out of the deadly crater. An aircraft in flames screamed overhead and slammed into a building. The explosion knocked the cadets to the ground, and Geordi's mouth filled with dirt. The alarms wailed like banshees, and he couldn't see more than a meter through the thick smoke. Then he knew the truth. They were going to die out here, like Jack 2 and the young soldiers. They had nothing to do with this war, but they were going to die just the same. Chapter 8. As the battle howled around him, Geordi rose to his feet and dusted himself off. He spit out the dirt and wiped the back of his hand across his mouth. Then he picked up his phase modulator and made sure it was okay. Geordi had decided that if he was going to die on some weird planet, it would be on his feet, not cowering in fear. "Will!" he shouted. "Here!" called his friend. With his trombone leading the way, Will staggered out of the smoke. "Let's stick together." "Right," agreed Geordi. "We've got to get underground to a basement or a shelter." With new resolve, the two of them climbed out of the crater. Where beautiful music had played only a few minutes ago, sirens, explosions, and jamming signals pounded Geordi's senses. But he discovered that by concentrating and keeping his fear in check, he could control his visor. When they reached the lip of the crater, Geordi glanced back to get an overall picture. It wasn't a pretty sight. There were many fallen Orions, and the medics couldn't get to all of them. Enemy craft lay in burning hulks on the streets or sticking out of buildings at odd angles. Nobody rushed to help the enemy wounded. Geordi shook his head at the futility of it. Their beautiful concert had turned into a disaster. The enemy must have known that thousands of Orions would be gathered in one place. They struck when they could create the maximum number of casualties. It was just one more element of insanity in the chaos. There came a sudden lull in the noise level. Orion soldiers started regrouping and falling back. A few aircraft kept streaking across the sky, but most of them were massing in formation behind the clouds. Geordi doubted whether anyone could see the craft but him. Were they massing for another attack? Will Riker frowned at a new dent on his trombone. "When you join Starfleet Academy band, they never tell you that people will be trying to kill you." Geordi grabbed Riker's arm and dragged him toward the nearest building. "Come on, we've got to get to cover." "Wait a minute," said Will. It got quieter. "Is the battle over?" "No," snapped Geordi. His acute hearing already picked up the whine of dozens of aircraft homing in. The sirens never stopped wailing, and he could sense the jamming frequencies shifting again. This battle wasn't over by a long shot. The sensory input continued to flow into Geordi's head, but he could process it now. He got the feeling that this was a decisive battle, made critical by the presence of outsiders. If the band escaped and returned home, this war would cease to be a dirty little secret. The Orion sensed it too. As they trained their weapons on the sky, they looked as if they were ready to fight until the end. The whine of jet engines buzzed in his skull, and Geordi knew that they had to seek underground shelter. He didn't think any place on the planet's surface would really be safe, but the ground offered the thickest protection. He spotted stairs going down into an alley. It was a long city block to the alley, so he punched Will in the shoulder to get him moving. "Come on!" "Hey, that hurt!" Geordi began to run. "Those aircraft will hurt a lot more, and they're coming back." Will glanced over his shoulder. No aircraft were in sight yet, but he didn't need much encouragement to run for it. He hefted his trombone and jogged into a street that was littered with bricks, glass, and wreckage. Before they had gotten halfway down the block, they heard shouts, followed by thunderous explosions. Geordi whirled around to see a sleek aircraft floating over the street. It raked the sidewalks and storefronts with deadly beams. Geordi and Will skidded around a corner and charged into the alleyway, just as a beam shattered the sidewalk where they had been. The craft veered off, but it banked slowly as if coming back to look for them. Without thinking, Geordi leapt over a railing and plunged down a narrow stairwell. He stumbled over the rubble, but he still managed to claw his way to the bottom. Will tumbled down after him, howling as he scraped against the wall. The aircraft swept over the alley and cut loose with its beamed weapons. The building above them shuddered and debris cascaded down. Geordi feared they would be crushed. Beaten and bruised, Will hauled himself to his feet, reared back, and kicked the wooden door to pieces. What was left of the glass shattered everywhere. He smashed the frame off its hinges and dragged Geordi inside, just as a block of cement thudded down the stairs. It was dark and smelly inside the basement. The only light came from a small, broken window on street level. Water leaked from somewhere and formed a scummy pool in the corner. The basement was empty, except for a few old rags, boxes, and spent hypos. Geordi guessed that the place Might have been used as a field hospital. Now it was too filthy for that or any other use. Will picked up a small sign from the wreckage and shook his head. Just our luck. It says this building has been condemned. A resounding explosion shook the building to its foundation, and Geordi shrunk against the wall. He waited for the ceiling to collapse on top of them, but it held, somehow. A second later, he heard the scream of a wounded aircraft streaking across the sky and plowing into a building. Geordi tapped his comm badge, not expecting any response. He wasn't disappointed. Communication's still out, he muttered. I wonder how the others are doing. Maybe the Gallant was able to beam some of them aboard, said Will. He didn't sound as if he believed it. I hope there aren't ships fighting in orbit, said Geordi. How do we know this war is just on the ground? Will shook his head and sat down. We don't know anything, except that we're caught in the crossfire. Outside, the explosion sounded farther away, as if the battle was moving on. Or, thought Geordi, maybe we're just getting used to the horrible sounds. He and Will didn't speak for several minutes as they strained to hear anyone approaching. Finally, Will spoke. Do you think serving in Starfleet is like this, with danger all the time? Geordi shook his head. I grew up in Starfleet. I don't remember it being like that. But maybe my parents didn't tell me when a situation was really bad. There's danger in space, hostile forces, but Starfleet prevents more problems than they get into. If only we could get the warring parties to sit down and talk. What are they fighting for? There's nothing left of this stupid planet. Will pounded his fist on the dirty floor, and a cloud of dust whirled upward. Geordi sighed. Sometimes wars go on way beyond any kind of common sense. Maybe the parties got tired of fighting, so they hired Orions and other mercenaries. Now they keep the war going without losing any of their own people. A box moved on the other side of the room, and Geordi and Will both jumped. Will staggered to his feet and stared nervously at the trash in the corner. What was that? Geordi squinted at the box, not quite believing his visor. It moved again, and a small furry animal dashed out, scurried across the floor, and disappeared under a clump of rags. It looked as if the creature was trying not to be caught. Yuck, said Will, wrinkling his nose. Rats. Geordi stared through his visor. I'm not so sure it is a rat. Well, maybe it's a mouse or a gopher, but it's in the rodent family. Maybe. Geordi got on his hands and knees and began to crawl toward the old clump of rags where the rodent had taken refuge. Will frowned. What are you doing, Geordi? Eventually we might get hungry enough to catch rats for food, but I'm not there yet. Me neither, Geordi assured him. You wouldn't want to eat this rat anyway, because it's not alive. What do you mean it's not alive? We just saw it running. Geordi shrugged as he edged closer to the rags. You know how I see things differently than you do? I see things like thermal energy. All mammals give off heat, but not this one. Instead, it gives off trace amounts of radiation. Will frowned. A radioactive rat? Come on, Geordi, don't go crazy on me. It's not a rat. Of course, it might be a creature that's very alien to us. Great, said Will. That still doesn't explain why you want to catch it. Curiosity, answered Geordi. He reached out, grabbed the rags, and yanked them into the air. A furry animal with a silver tail squeaked and snarled at him. Then it lunged for his face. Will's boot caught the critter just centimeters from Geordi's nose and sent it flying through the air. It bounced off a wall and fell into a pool of scum on the floor. Panting, Geordi turned to look at the rodent. It squirmed on its back for a few seconds, and bright sparks arced into the water from its stomach. Then it rolled over and dashed toward a hole in the wall. Will blinked in amazement. Hey, did that rat just give off sparks? Geordi lunged to block the hole, and the rat skidded to a stop. Fearful it would bite him, Geordi yelled, Get away! Go! The thing reversed course and headed toward Will. That's what I've been trying to tell you, said Geordi. It's a tiny robot disguised to look like a rodent. It's probably transmitting information. And maybe a spy. A spy? Will lifted his foot and stomped the rat as it scurried past. He caught its tail under his heel, and the mechanical beast turned to snap at him with gleaming teeth. In reflex, Will jerked his foot back, and the rat escaped, leaving behind a few centimeters of its tail. To Geordi, the tail looked like an antenna. Geordi grabbed one of the boxes off the floor and gave chase. "Get the rags!" he shouted. "Something to throw over it." Will dutifully grabbed a handful of grimy rags and joined the hunt. Geordi tried not to think of the absurdity of two guys crawling around in a basement trying to catch a mechanical rat while a war raged all around them. They finally herded the rat into a corner, and it had nowhere to run. With mechanical repetition, it snarled and snapped at them. "If we catch it," asked Riker doubtfully, "what are we going to do with it?" "It's a reconnaissance robot," said Geordi. "It may be communicating with those fighters up there. Maybe it told them about gathering of Orions. Maybe it could tell us how to get out of here, or who's behind this war." Will smiled wearily. "I thought you said that we couldn't do anything about the war." "That's before I was in it," said Geordi. "A device like this must have some electronic signatures. Are you ready?" "Yeah." Geordi tossed his box over the mechanical rat, and Will flung his rags like a net. It worked, and they trapped the tiny robot under several layers of debris. The creature banged around inside the box and tried to gnaw its way out. Geordi plopped on top of the box and struggled to keep it down. He only hoped that the thing wouldn't gnaw its way through the top. "Grab the modulator," shouted Geordi. The box bounced up and down beneath him. Will stared at him. "What?" "Grab my phase modulator. We've got to shut this thing off. Maybe I can jam its circuits." Will nodded and picked up the strange oval-shaped device from the floor. He handed it to Geordi, who turned it on and began to press buttons. The phase modulator was actually a very sophisticated device capable of generating much more than sound waves. By phase shifting, it could affect brain waves and relax the listener, or so the Corridans claimed. At the very least, it could transmit an amazing array of frequencies. In the close quarters of the basement, Geordi bombarded the little robot with waves. The phase modulator began to shriek, and Will held his hands over his ears. Geordi kept pressing buttons while the thing in the box kept bumping, fighting, and gnawing. Finally, the frequencies went beyond the range of human hearing, and Will slumped against the wall with relief. A moment later, the thing in the box grew quiet as well. At least its movement stopped. Geordi looked at his friend. "We should have a plan to contain it." Will looked around the room and found a long metal pipe. He hefted it like a baseball bat. "I've got a plan to contain it. Go ahead, lift the box." Geordi swallowed hard, bent down, and stripped off the filthy rags. Will braced his legs and lifted the pipe over his head as Geordi grabbed the box and hoisted it up.